An organization with high data volume workloads have successfully moved DynamoDB after having many issues with traditional database systems. However, a few months into production, Dynamo tables are consistently recording high latency. Which of the following would you suggest to reduce latency? Select two. Reduce connection pooling, which keeps the connections alive even when user requests aren't present, thereby blocking the services. Use DAX for businesses with heavy write-only workloads. Use eventually consistent reads instead of strongly consistent reads when possible. Consider using global tables if your app is accessed by globally distributed users. Increase the request timeout setting so the client gets enough time to complete the request, thereby reducing retries on the system. Consider using global tables if your application is accessed by globally distributed users. Use eventually consistent reads in place of strongly consistent reads whenever possible. Okay. Increasing timeout settings might hide the symptoms of underlying latency issues without actually solving them. It's important to identify and address the root cause. Okay. And then the connection pool helps in efficiently managing connections to the database by reusing existing connections instead of creating new ones for each request. It can be it can be resource intensive and lead to increased latency. A company wants to implement authentication for its new RESTful API service that uses API Gateway. To authenticate the calls, each request must include HTTP headers for the client ID and user ID. These credentials must be compared to the authentication data in a DynamoDB table. Which of the following would you recommend for implementing this authentication and gateway? Authorize using Cognito that will reference authentication table of DynamoDB. Develop Lambda authorizer that references the authentication in the data in the DynamoDB table. Set up an API gateway model that requires credentials, then grant API gateway access to the authentication table of DynamoDB. Update the API gateway integration requests to require the credentials, then grant API gateway access to the authentication table in DynamoDB. Develop Lambda authorizer that references the authentication data in the DAO. Our customer that allow you to use a Lambda function to authenticate API requests. Okay. Wrong. Setting up an API gateway model that requires credentials and granting API to the authenticator is not the idea. Granting API gateway direct access to the authentication table could pose security risks. Okay. As a developer, you are working on a mobile application that utilizes SQS for sending messages to downstream data systems for further processing. One of the requirements is that the messages should be stored in the queue for a period of 12 days. How will you configure this requirement? Enable long polling for the SQS queue. The max retention period of SQS message is 7 days. Therefore, the retention period of 12 days is impossible. Change the queue message retention setting. Use a FIFO SQS queue. Change the queue message retention setting. You are a developer working at a cloud company that embraces serverless. You have performed your initial deployment and would like to work towards adding API gateway stages and associate them with existing deployments. Your stages will include prod, test, and dev, and you will need to match a Lambda function variant that can be updated over time. Which of the following features must you add to achieve this? Lambda, X-ray integration, stage variables, Lambda versions, mapping templates, Lambda aliases. Stage variables, Lambda aliases. It's like a pointer to a specific function version. Users can access. I don't understand that. Okay. Wrong. Lambda versions. Versions are immutable and cannot be updated over time. So this option is wrong. This is correct. Okay. Your team has just signed up year-long contract with a client maintaining a 3-tier web application that needs to be moved to cloud. The application has steady traffic throughout the day and needs to be on a reliable system with no downtime or access issues. The solution needs to be cost optimal for the startup. Which of the following options should you choose? EC2 reserved instances, on-premise EC2 instance, EC2 spot instances, EC2 on-demand instances. Reserved instance, reliability and no downtime, offer a dedicated capacity and reserved computing power, ensuring consistent performance. Okay, it's good for cost savings. Okay, that's it. That is it. We did it. We did it, Joe.